Sanctions have been imposed on 82 individuals and 29 companies. German payment provider Wirecard went bankrupt on Tuesday.
Russia has launched an unprecedented disinformation campaign against...
Billions of dollars have been found in various offshore accounts.
Welcome to Integrity Insights, the Berlin Risk podcast. Hello, listeners. Welcome to the first spring episode of 2026. I teamed up with my dear colleagues Verena Horne and Davids Alksnis to talk about how Berlin Risk conducts background checks and due diligence investigations. Both Verena and Davids are real masters of their craft and have a lot to share on the subject. I very much enjoyed talking to them, and I hope you do too. Verena, Davids, welcome on the podcast.
Hi, good to be here.
Hi, happy to be here.
We have already had a conversation with Verena, I think about 2 years ago, about sanctions. Davids is new on the podcast, so maybe I can ask you, Davids, first to briefly introduce yourself.
Right, thanks for having me, Philip. I think I've been a listener of the podcast for longer than I've been a colleague, I think. It's great work you do here. I joined Berlin Risk a year and a half ago. I come from a broader background in security investigations. And this pivot to corporate intelligence that we do here at Berlin Risk, that was definitely new to me. So I remember feeling very much intimidated by you two, all the other talented people at Berlin Risk when I started out. So yeah, I had a lot to learn.
Thank you. Verena, as I said, some listeners might already be familiar with you, but can you just remind those of the listeners who don't, what do you do?
Yeah, hi Philip. I'm director at Berlin Risk, and I was on the podcast a couple of years ago before you became an internet sensation. So yeah, it's really good to be back.
Well, thank you, Bod, for coming on the podcast. Today we will be talking about the topic of background checks and due diligence investigations, which is what we do on a daily basis, right? And maybe the first question, because I already mentioned those two terms, background checks and due diligence, can we maybe, Verena, distinguish somehow between those two terms?
Yeah, we can. I mean, they're often used interchangeably by people, but technically due diligence would be background checks would be kind of a screening, initial checks, a little bit more of a surface level investigation, a first step, say, and due diligence would be sort of a more in-depth, structured investigation where you really try and get to the bottom of any issues that might have come up in the first background check. So that's kind of broadly how we define it. But as I said, people use the terms interchangeably often.
Okay, that's good. That's a good starting point. Let's maybe talk about what type of clients come to us to do either a background check or a due diligence investigation, and what do they typically want us to find out? Whoever wants to start, maybe Davids.
So I think usually the client, and this depends, of course, but usually so they come to us when there's a decision they want to make and there's a certain level of uncertainty. And so that can be an investor who's looking at a company, that could be a fund who's choosing service providers, or it could be any kind of business that's looking to go into a new market, anything like that, really. And so they generally want to know not just if there's a problem on paper, but whether there are your reputational, integrity, maybe source of wealth issues, anything that could affect them after that decision's made, So plainly said, I think most of the clients who come to us, they want to know, okay, so who are these people? we're looking to do business with. How do they operate, and what risks are we taking on if we proceed?
Is there anything you would like to add to this, Verena?
Yeah, I mean, I think David's covered the main issues, but I mean, traditionally, I guess we've worked for large institutions that have had kind of more traditional, kind of clear need to protect their reputation and integrity, and they're investing in potentially challenging jurisdictions. But increasingly, we find that we have more clients such as kind of private equity and so forth, where they really need to carry out background checks on their investment targets. And that, in these cases, they're sinking a lot of money into their into these ventures. They're usually taking a controlling stake, but they're not really close enough to the companies to really understand or evaluate the risks, which is what Davids was talking about. I mean, and they want these companies to really grow, to expand. There's a lot at stake here, and they really need to understand if the target has the people there within the structure to really be able to meet those targets, to meet those requirements. And they need to understand the hidden liabilities, which might ultimately threaten the value of their investments. As I said, there's a lot at stake. Sometimes we're also approached by these companies. They want to install top executives. It's very similar. They need to know that these people have the skills to carry out their, the necessary job. Basically, on a basic level, we're looking at. There are the top level kind of reputational issues that are legal. They want to make sure that the that where Davids mentioned source of funds, they need to make sure they're not inadvertently being involved in money laundering, or or the people that they're running their companies aren't acting as proxies for sanctioned individuals. These are kind of high level things, but there's also, are they legitimate and serious business people they're dealing with? Is there a reputational risk associated with the person? What is their business track record like? Have any of their previous ventures failed in a really spectacular way that they weren't aware of? Do they even have the right temperament? Those kinds of things. If a person's been posting kind of really, really crazy and outrageous things online, deep, on social media somewhere, this ultimately is a potential liability. So there's a range of risks that our clients are thinking about.
And why do the clients reach out to us as opposed to doing those type of checks themselves in-house?
Mostly, I guess it's a resources and skills factor. They might, most clients are able to do a Google search or even use an AI these days to kind of run a name check, or they might even have access to LexisNexis or something like that. But these are really kind of high level checks, and they don't really get to the bottom of things. You might find. And often that is the case. The clients will come to us because they found a news article that they don't really know what to make. They don't really know how to make sense of it. Say there's a rumor somewhere that, there's that there might have been the source of funds might not be quite legit, but they don't really know how to assess this information. They've already put loads of time and work into preparing this deal, and they're kind of confused. They don't know how to move forward, and how to assess this. So they come to us, obviously, because we are experts in digging a lot deeper, and using various tools to help us, help the client get clarity on how serious those risks are and how likely they are to, in the future, either cause a reputational risk or really threaten the investment on a larger scale.
So how do you actually go about finding this information? Let's say someone comes up to you and says, hey, I want to do business with this individual in this particular jurisdiction, and I want to make sure that there's no there's no issues there. Like, what type of resources do you use? How do you approach these investigations, Davids?
I think we always want to start with a discussion with the client. We want to start with finding out the question, and only then proceeding to the different tools. So you want to define clearly what the client actually needs to know. and from that you can build a source strategy, a collection strategy, and that will always include, public records. It will include corporate filings, court databases, sanctions checks. We cover adverse media as well. Various forms of OSINT, your archived web content, your investigation of certain domains. But then the point is never to collect everything possible, right? It is to collect the right information from the right places in a verified manner. So I think that's generally the approach.
So, and if this is a good point actually, Davids, because I imagine, especially in this day and age, there's so much information out there that it's probably not even possible to collect everything. But how do you make sure that you collect, the right or relevant information for the specific case? Do you have do you work with some sort of a specific methodology?
I think the general methodology of investigations hasn't really changed that much over the years. I feel like, the field of OSINT for sure has grown and changed, and there's always new tools and new data sources. But the approach itself, you can speak about the traditional way of looking at it, the intelligence cycle. That's stayed the same. So what you have to do is you have to have a very rigorous, very consistent, very determined mindset, and then follow steps according a predefined methodology. So the ideal would be that you pull on loose threads until all your questions are answered. However, that's obviously not. That's the ideal scenario. That's very rarely the case.
And does it ever happen that you are looking at a particular individual or a company and you deal with the opposite problem? So instead of having too much information to deal with, you have zero information.
I feel like you two would agree that those are the more fun cases, right? So it's much. I think it's much different work, but it tends to be much more satisfying, because then you really have to get inventive, right? Then you really have to go, all right, so what is a pivot point here? What's a data source that I can look into here? Who's a person I can ask? How can I look at this differently? That's the outside of the box kind of thinking, and it normally it leads to, if done well, it leads to a clear-cut answer. Whereas, for these massive conglomerates that we work on, sometimes, you always have to focus in on something very specific. An aspect is most that you can cover, right? So yeah, so those are two very different types of investigations.
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, I have this often when, let's say, I'm looking at a particular individual, and usually, especially if the person is, I don't know, let's like a 60 plus of age, then it's more common that the person has like lower digital footprint, and it's more difficult to find information on that person. Or there are obviously instances where a person might deliberately try to really minimize their digital footprint, which then can be a finding in itself, right? Because that's a specific type of behavior. I was also wondering if you guys have some particular examples of investigations where the subject appeared at first to be legitimate but turned out to be a complete fraud, or I don't know, any kind of favorite investigations that you could share in some anonymized way.
Yeah, I mean, this it's always an interesting situation, right? Because as an investigator, you feel this sense of accomplishment when you do find these things out, but then it's most often it's bad news for the client. So, and there have been several such cases in my time here with Berlin Risk where we've uncovered, well, just fairly ridiculous attempts at fraud, meaning that the front that a certain individual or company had put up, the front was believable at first sight, enough, however, for the client to, probably, I don't know, suspect something, because they did, give it to us to investigate further. And then when we look into it, I remember this one case we had in the Middle East, which it was a company that were up for a multi-million-dollar public tender, where they said they're gonna build a massive IT infrastructure, right? And they claimed they had all this experience and all these projects already under their belt, and then it all crumbled away as we proceeded. So you went from these massive claims to finding out that it was actually just this one very, very I suppose delusional individual who was on the run from another jurisdiction, had already multiple accounts of fraud, and was just attempting to pull another scheme. And it was just, I remember working on it, and it was just such an experience, to talk to people who've been close to this individual and to uncover this step by step. And then, of course, when presenting this to the client, you want to be as objective as possible. But in some of these cases, you want to give the client the entire picture, because the story is just so interesting. But
yeah, I think it's an important point as well, because some of these, especially as Verena said in the beginning, some of these more complex due diligence investigations are often kind of narrative driven, because we have so much findings, so much information that we kind of need to be able to tell a story based on the findings, which is based on open sources. But what I understand, you just mentioned that, Davids, that you were talking to people close to that subject. So the investigations are based not just on open sources. You also conduct interviews.
Yeah, for sure. So it's not just OSINT research. I mean, open sources are essential, but in many jurisdictions, they only get you so far. They just show a part of the picture. So we do routinely conduct source inquiries. So that's often through a network of trusted partners, and that's especially when public data is either thin or non-existent, or when we want context around certain things. So reputational questions or relationships or decision-making processes. So these are the type of things that are not likely to be reflected, in open source data. So the work is very people-driven, and I think that's one of the things we pride ourselves in here in Berlin Risk. So we build these relationships, we develop them with our partners across the world, right? And so it's not easy. So they're not doing easy work. We have great trust in them, and some of these people we work with, for years and years, and it's really become just this. I don't know. We've built up so many memories with some of them that you go like, man, we've been through a lot. So yeah.
And Verena, what kind of type of sources do you usually interview?
Yeah, I mean, usually it really depends. It usually builds on the OSINT level, as Davids was saying. Like, there's public records can only go so far, right? So in lots of European countries, even there's public records will really not be adequate. Even Germany, where we're based, right? I mean, court records are completely inaccessible. So if someone gets into scrapes with the law, but they don't make it into the media, this is not going to be something that public records will tell you. So we, or OSINT might tell you where a person worked or what projects they were involved in, but not really how well that project was received. So the kind of people that we would usually, in a standard background checks, usually they're not quite as spectacular as the ones that David's described. They might be quite routine. We might just talk to some former colleagues of the person, some people that sat on the board with them who really know what their strengths and weaknesses are like. We might talk to competitors. We often talk to competitors. They might be aware of the subject's track record in their sector, and they might be, obviously with somebody like competitors within a sector, we have to be careful how we deal with those sources because there's a potential for bias. But oftentimes competitors are more likely to really be willing to spill the beans. They might not have such a personal relationship to the client, but will know what not the client, the subject, but will know what they've done and how it's been received in the sector. So it's good to get a spread of sources. And then obviously, as I said, it's informed by the OSINT. So if something comes up and we realize, for example, that we have indications in OSINT that something's not quite right, we might choose then more sector specific, or we might choose a lawyer or legal expert to really dig further. We might talk to journalists that are really familiar with a case if there's a lot of media around a case, or academics or experts who can otherwise contextualize the issue. David's mentioned context, and that's super important, that we can say, okay, definitely cut through the media hype, because often, in a lot of these jurisdictions, it's not, I was talking about Germany, and, Germany isn't particularly transparent in its public records, but it has a really a good media landscape that is reliable. But then you have a place, say, like Jordan, which comparatively is quite transparent in terms of corporate records. You can get quite a lot of shareholding information, but the media landscape is quite, can be challenging, to some extent. You won't get the true picture from the media. So there's these, and in those cases, we need to weigh up and we need to dig a little bit further, but the kind of sources that we look at will be different. Yeah.
And are you limited to any specific jurisdictions? You just mentioned, Verena, obviously Germany, Jordan. David's also mentioned Middle East before. Is there any, do you work all around the world, or do you have some limitations in that regard?
No, we don't have any limitations. We work pretty much everywhere, and we have worked pretty much everywhere. We came, I guess, out of a strong focus on the CIS and Eastern Europe and Northern Africa and the Middle East, but we do work everywhere, just by default. A lot of our subjects for background checks and due diligence, they will have business interests across the whole world. So, we're looking at people with business interests in offshore jurisdictions where there's almost no information, to kind of, the Balkans, or places where there's a lot more transparency. And then, right across Asia, and Africa, sub-Saharan Africa increasingly. So yeah, it's a global operation, and that makes it fun.
And does the work differ significantly, when you move from one country to another? You mentioned before, Verena, that there's this distinction between Germany and Jordan in the sense of the public information availability and media landscapes. That's obviously something that can complicate the investigation. Is there anything else that you could share?
Yeah, yeah. As I mentioned, transparency of records is a huge challenge. And also, so as I said, offshore jurisdictions where notoriously there's almost nothing. You might pay $100 just to get a proof of registration of a company. You might have an address. You might not even get directorships. You certainly won't get shareholdings. And then you have some countries where, at a click of a button, you can search corporate registers for directors, with shareholding information, everything up front. And it's not necessarily jurisdictions that you'd expect. So a lot of the ex-CIS countries and as I mentioned, the Balkans, they're really, really transparent, and it's easy to get information there on corporate registers and shareholdings, which is great. Whereas we've had the opposite effect in some of Western European countries where we've seen UBO registers, that's ultimate beneficial ownership registers, closing up access. And we also have, places, obviously, it also differs within regions. Within the Middle East, some jurisdictions are pretty open and transparent and becoming more and more transparent because they want to attract legitimate and respectable international business. But then you have other places where investigations are extremely challenging. We've had cases in Saudi looking at source of wealth, and then again you have the balance between the fact that, as you said, in a lot of countries there isn't this tradition of online or OSINT online activity. We had a case in Saudi Arabia when we were looking for a client in the EU into a source of wealth issue, and the client was concerned because there's just no online trace of where the source of wealth for this business that they wanted to invest in was coming from. But that's not unusual in the Saudi context. So in that case, we had to dig a little deeper with some human source interviews. I don't know if that answers your question, but maybe Davids has more to add on that.
Yeah, I think I wanted to add to what Verena explained about the differences in when it comes to OSINT, but the same can be said about source inquiries. It's very much a different situation, asking questions in I don't know, Germany, as opposed to, say, a country in the Middle East. People in different countries have different cultural norms, and their willingness to talk differs, and what they might say or what they consider worthy of saying or what they think is appropriate to say, it very much differs on the cultural context, on the jurisdiction, and of course on the level of access you have.
Yeah, agreed. Oh, sorry, go on, Philip.
Yeah, I mean, cultural differences. We just had a podcast, by the way. I would like to invite everyone to listen to our last podcast where we talk about doing OSINT investigations in different languages, and we spoke exactly about the subject, how you have to consider a little the culture of the place where you investigate to kind of know where to look for information. And I'm conscious of the time, guys. We are approaching the 30-minute mark, but I would like to just one last thing, because I feel like this is something I cannot really we cannot really avoid this topic, and I've also discussed this already with our last two guests on the podcast, that topic of AI, which if we go back to the research part of our work, this has obviously been affected by that technology. Maybe Davids, can you tell us a couple of words about how Berlin Risk has been dealing with the challenge?
I think it's affected us in a lot of ways. I feel like many changes have already occurred. I'm sure many are still to come, but it's a mixed bag, really. So your generative AI tools are very useful, but they're not magic. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit, of course, that you can use them for. Like combining or a lot of different sources of information into just dumping them into one place and then combing through them. These large amounts of text that we can now sift through quickly with the help of AI in no time. That's massively important, and that's a great boost to how we do research. However, then the flip side of that is that we now have to spend significantly more time and effort on verification. Right, because so now you're stuck looking for, all right, so I have this little needle in the haystack, but then was it really there? How did it come there? How can I pinpoint it back to wherever the AI got it from? And then of course, I feel like there's a I don't know. I feel like this verification burden, it's becoming increasingly more relevant. And I would say at this point, generative AI tools, they're valuable assistants to us, but they're no substitute. They're no substitute for just the methodology that you use for a sheer hard skepticism as a general approach, and for the human judgment, right? Because at the end of the day, it's got to be the distinction between raw information and intelligence is still valid. And what we deliver is intelligence. And so that intelligence consists in judgment calls. It consists in a conclusion that the client can act on. It should be actionable. And so that means that, I mean, I'm not saying that generative AI can't give you that. What I'm saying is that we're the ones going to the client and saying, this is what it is. So you have to be willing to stand by it and stand for it. And so you have to trust it. And I think trust then is the name of the game with AI these days. Again, I'm very hopeful. I'm very optimistic. We're trying to integrate just as many AI tools as we can, as quickly as we can. But then, yeah, I always urge just a certain healthy dose of skepticism as well.
Is there anything else you would like to add, Verena?
No, I think Davids has summarized it very well. I mean, it's just, you see the problem that we have with AI is just the lack of consistency. I think, you know, we you might spend a lot of time building a prompt and get a wonderful response and be able to, you know, dig out a lot of information. And then you try the same again and it doesn't. So that then you're faced with this exact problem, a lack of a trust deficit. And, you know, there's this expectation that AI must have made our lives a lot easier, and that we can, and as David said, it's absolutely true. The extraction of information is easier, but it's this lack of trust and the necessity to be skeptical. Yeah, I completely agree.
Well said. Well, guys, I know that there's a lot of projects in the pipeline waiting for you, so I'll let you go. But Davids, Verena, thank you both for coming on the podcast. It's been great, and I will see you in the office.
Thank you, Philip.